As funding for mental health is increasingly difficult to come by, and social services continue to shrink, it will become more important than ever to ensure the patients that need treatment the most can get it. Watering down the definition of psychotic delusion to include theists would send healthcare into a tailspin. Although it's debatable whether free will exists at all or not, thanks Sam Harris, excellent book by the way, I can safely say in lay terms that inasmuch as it does exist, theists are choosing to believe because it meets their intellectual, emotional, and social needs to do so. They are not grossly departed from the skeptic. Not in medical terms anyway. They are not mentally ill. Finally, skeptics need to be careful what we wish for. If delusional people are to be hospitalized for reprogramming, and atheists define religion as delusional, what's to stop the theists from doing the same to us? Skeptics tend to believe that something came from nothing as a way for understanding the origins of the universe. Although I tend to find the something from nothing argument sound after studying physics and reading essays written by Hawking and Tyson, one can easily see how quickly the idea of labeling and demonizing can be used against us. Something from nothing. You need medicine. Labeling as sick the wide range of normal human behavior. And what has forever been part of the human experience, belief without evidence, is a threat to Western democracy and the pluralism enjoyed in most free societies. Skeptics need to win the battle of ideas and work to improve the human condition with art, science, medicine, and innovation. We need to be united in exuding empathy, offering compassion, and engaging in humanitarian efforts for social justice and peaceful coexistence. Hospitalizing grandma to reprogram her belief in a theistic God is not a good idea. She can pray for things to get better, and we can join the Thinking Atheist chat room and share ideas and try new things to improve this condition known as the human experience. No hospital and no medicine necessary. Regards, Herbert. Herbert, thank you very much for the email. I don't know that I've met a lot of people who say that people who are religious deserve to be hospitalized or reprogrammed. I do hear the word delusion and delusional when we speak about religious belief. Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion provided sort of a cornerstone for that argument, and I do see it as a form of delusion. But in my mind, I don't see it as the kind of delusion that I would consider warranting hospitalization or the cordoning off of other resources designed for the genuinely mentally ill. We are talking about a cultural thing. That's my take on it, but I'd really like to talk to an expert. Guess what? I've got one on the line, my special guest tonight. His name is Dr. Caleb Lack. He is a clinical psychologist and educator on psychology, critical thinking, and science versus pseudoscience. He writes the Great Plains Skeptic column on the Skeptic Inc. network, and he's a friend, and I'm glad he's on the show.
Thanks for having me on, Seth.
Let's talk about that first email. As you were listening on hold, did you have any thoughts as to Herb's take on psychiatry, on delusion, on how to approach mental illness in relation to religion? Anything strike that you want to talk about?
Yeah, I think that Herbert was very much spot on in terms of saying, culturally accepted belief, when it's widespread, is not a delusion in terms of the clinical sense of the word. A nice way to think about it might be when you hear somebody who's a denier of science say, oh, well, evolution is just a theory. And by theory, they mean guess. But when we say theory, we mean something else entirely. And so when, someone like Dawkins with his title of his book says The God Delusion, he's certainly using it maybe more in a colloquial sense than a truly clinical sense. Because when you think about mental illness and delusions, Herbert gave great examples of what those are and defined those very well. And that's not the sort of everyday, oh, you're deluded because you think that Coke is better than Pepsi or whatever. And I think it's very dangerous when we have people throw around those kind of terms that can be seen as clinical or as very problematic without actually knowing what they mean. You have the Kansas State School Board slap evolution is just a theory on your textbooks, just like you have people say, oh, religious belief is a delusion. Those are both pretty ridiculous statements to me.
You've encountered people who've said, they're just delusional. They believe in magic. They believe in superstition. They believe in fairies. They believe in angels. They're just delusional. You think that's an inappropriate term in this context?
Yeah, I really think it is. I'm a clinical psychologist. I see people with fairly severe mental illness all the time, in addition to, teaching about it in my job at the university. And I think for someone to say the word delusion, what they're really talking about is, I don't believe the same thing they do. And just because I don't believe the same thing you do doesn't mean that you're deluded in terms of a clinical sense of the word. So let me give you some examples. We see a lot of religious themes in the disorder that's my specialty, which is obsessive-compulsive disorder. One of the most frequent kinds of obsessions, which are these intrusive, unwanted thoughts, are religious-based obsessions, where I think that I'm blasphemous, or I feel like I perhaps have sinned in some way, and I have to pray a certain way, or otherwise, I'm damning my family to hell. And when we have somebody come in with those are obviously so far outside of the bounds of normal religious belief that it's easy to say, yeah, this person, they're experiencing mental illness. They have something seriously wrong with them that's causing them to have functional impairment. But when you have people who say, oh, well, I believe in this or that particular deity or these rules about this deity, and it's a culturally accepted belief, it's by, a small percentage of the culture, to call that a delusion I think it's demeaning and it's insulting, in addition to just kind of being wrong in a technical sense. And it's a way of trying to, I think, separate or make yourself feel better compared to that group. I don't believe those things, so you're deluded, as opposed to, trying to understand, okay, well, why do you believe those things and I don't believe those things? What's the difference between us? And instead, it's just sort of insulting, I think.
Why do intelligent people often hold to unreasonable beliefs or irrational beliefs?
That's a great question.
It's also probably like a hugely broad question, and so I want to apologize in advance. It's probably a series of 6 shows and a whole lecture and several books, but
that's right.
I've called the show The Psychology of Belief, and I want to really start with getting down to the nitty-gritty. When you see somebody who is so freaking intelligent in every other area of his or her life, and then you see one part of I called this the other day, this is the place where the weird shit lives, right? This is where all of the crazy stuff that any scrutiny would dismantle immediately, it lives in this little protected membrane in here, and I want to know how this happened. So can you give the rest of us a primer on this, Caleb?
Sure. And, I think what's important to sort of step back and look at is, why do we believe anything that we do? Not just, why does someone believe something that's odd or strange or weird in comparison to this or that group? Because it's the same sort of underlying psychological mechanisms that are at play for believing that, Jesus is the Son of God, that it is for believing that vaccines are bad for you. And so I think that what you really want to step into how the human brain works and the ways that we naturally tend to fool ourselves when we are encountering information in our environment. And there's lots of evidence out there showing that your propensity towards believing certain things or having certain kinds of political ideology may be partially biological in terms of genetics and epigenetics. But there's a whole lot more evidence showing that, okay, well, why do we look at certain information and say, I'm going to believe this information? And then we look at other kinds of information and we say, oh, that's bullshit. I'm just going to completely ignore that. And it has a lot to do, I think, with how our brains are set up to process information from around us in the world. And so if you think about kind of the most common thing that we as humans do, it's we try and protect ourselves. We try and protect ourselves physically, and we try and protect ourselves mentally. And one of the ways that we try and protect ourselves mentally is by not challenging things that we believe. So we in psychology have actually a specific name for this, and it's called the confirmation bias. And the thing that's really interesting about, let's say that you and I are in conversation like we are tonight, and I say something that doesn't match up with something that you believe. You've got a couple of options at that point. you've got an option to say, okay, well, I'm going to change my beliefs and admit that I was wrong. Or you've got an option to say, hey, this guy is obviously dumb and stupid, and I'm going to ignore that information. And what we tend to do, just naturally, is we tend to ignore and discount information that doesn't fit with our already held beliefs. So I'm not talking necessarily about how we got there, but more of why it's maintained at this point. And we've got all these cognitive biases that we use. And the confirmation bias is probably the biggest bias that we have in terms of how we process information. And this is simply, I favor information that confirms my belief in my idea, and I discount information that does not support my idea. And we think about, why would we do that? Why would we as humans have this natural tendency? It starts to make sense. What do we call people who are constantly doubting themselves, who think they're wrong all the time, who have problems with all sorts of decision-making because they can't fit things into a certain box? You know what we call those people? We call them depressed. Right? So we have people who are depressed because I'm constantly doubting myself. I don't think that I'm any good. I don't think that I'm right. And then people who are not depressed, they tend to do very little doubting of themselves, which is pretty interesting. And this is, of course, this is for all information. This isn't just for religious ideology. But let's take religion as an example. Let's say that I'm a firm believer in the literal interpretation of the Bible. And I say, okay, well, there were Moses and the Jews that were in Egypt, and, they were enslaved, and then they escaped across the Red Sea and wandered for 40 years, and all that literally happened. And then I have an archaeologist who comes up and says, oh, yeah, we have zero evidence that any of this actually happened, that the Jews were ever in Egypt to begin with. There's no evidence of a mass wandering around the desert. There's not even really any evidence that they would have crossed the Red Sea. It was probably the Reed Sea instead. And if I'm a believer in the little interpretation of the Bible, I'm not going to carefully consider that information, right? I'm not going to look at it and say, you know what, let me think about this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hear that, and I'm going to say, that conflicts with what I believe. Therefore, you're a dirty liar. Instead of saying, let me look at this. And I'm going to do that because who likes to be wrong? Nobody likes to be wrong. We hate being wrong, most of us anyway. And so when we're confronted with these things, if I'm, again, that believer in the literal interpretation of the Bible, and one of my friends comes over and we're talking about this is an amazing thing that happened and how great Yahweh was to lead people out of here, and we talk about, of course this is true, then I'm going to be like, yes, that information comes in my brain, and I say, welcome home, right? I accept it. I'm happy to get that information. But then when someone else comes and says something different, I say, basically, screw you, right? That information contradicts what I believe. I'm just going to shut the door in the face of that information and say, get the hell off my porch. Don't come back. Get off.
Is it about pride? Is it about ego? Is it about comfort? Is it because we hold our beliefs, especially religious beliefs, in such high regard? They're so cherished to us that if they are challenged, it's almost like someone insulted our children, so we take it personally. I mean, why would I be so averse to vetting information that is presented contrary to what I currently believe? Why would I be so resistant?
I think the big issue there is exactly what you brought up. So I'm being challenged on this deeply held belief that I have. Or even not even deeply held. We still don't like to be wrong. And what does that mean? I believe that this particular thing is right. You show me that it's wrong, that it's untrue, that there weren't any Jews in Egypt, or that vaccines are perfectly safe, or that UFOs don't land and anally probe people on a regular basis. What I do is I say, this contradicts what I believe. That means that I'm wrong. And if I'm wrong, shit, that's not good for me. I hate that. We don't like to be wrong because that means that I've been believing something that's untrue. That makes me feel dumb. That makes me feel stupid. That makes me not be a good person. And so it's very much a protective mechanism. This is widespread. You do this. I do this. Everyone on earth does this. And it's very hard to kind of change your way of thinking to not do that. Even those of us who study these sort of things and teach other people about them and who pride ourselves on trying to be rational, we still do this. I mean, this is very much a knee-jerk cognitive reaction, if you will, to information. You know, I don't like to be wrong. No one likes to be wrong. You give me information that says I'm wrong, I automatically have that response of no. That's not good. And what's interesting is there's lots of research showing that the more
August 11th, new PB, Michael Garber. What did it turn out to be? I don't know, let's see. It's a good one. 370, 450.